Welcome back to another episode of the Two Christian Dudes podcast. As you probably already have figured out, if you've been following us throughout season one, we are continuing our conversations about near-death experiences. We have another pilot on today. You may have heard our interview a number of weeks back with Captain Dale Black, and today we are going to be speaking with Jim Woodford. And I'm going to pitch it to Randy to give us a quick intro to Jim, and we will get into his exciting story. All right, Jim, Randy, welcome to the conversation. Randy, take it away, sir.
Jim, it's great to have you. Jim has a fascinating story. He was a successful businessman, pilot, as Sean mentioned, and then a rare disease killed him. And he had an experience with heaven. You're not going to want to miss this episode, and you'll want to hear it straight through, because at the end you're going to hear something very encouraging. So, Jim, it is great to hear you. Please share your story. It is absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you, Randy and Sean, for having me, and for for the opportunity to, I think, give people hope, because if you ever considered yourself a lost cause, I'm the walking billboard when it comes to God. So my book that I wrote, Heaven, An Unexpected Journey, truly was that, an unexpected journey. So to give you a little background, and Randy, feel free to interrupt me, because there's so much to tell you in such a short time. I always feel a little panicky, because I feel if I leave something out, it may be the one thing that would bring someone closer to God. So please bear with me. So this happened to me back in 2014, August 21st, or April 21st, sorry. April 21st of 2014. And look, I was not a Christian, so to speak. I was raised Catholic. Didn't mean a whole lot to me, except it was a good hockey team at the church. And I was born, I'm Canadian. I was born in Newfoundland, Canada, which is sort of in the northeast. And where summer is on a Wednesday from 2 to 4. But I loved it, and it was my home. My dad died when I was very young. I was only 2, and my mom was left a widow with 2 young boys, and she was only 23. So, but I had a wonderful upbringing. We lived with my paternal grandparents, and they were a wonderful Irish Catholic family. And so nothing traumatic happened to me. I don't remember my father, of course, but we were surrounded by love in a remote area of the Canadian hinterlands, and I had a good life. One of the things that I got used to as a young boy was watching the seaplanes that would come in and land on the lakes to bring supplies and that sort of thing. And I became enamored with aviation. And so by the time I reached 18, that was what I wanted to do with my life. And although we were quite poor, my mom arranged somehow for me to borrow the funds to put me through aviation school. And so at 18, I graduated. So I was back in 1967. If you can imagine a world without cell phones or satellites. And of course, growing up in the bush, I was able to land a job with a bush flying company. And from there, my career eventually blossomed into flying larger aircraft and working all over the world. And so, like anyone starting a new job, I loved it. If you're lucky enough in life to have a profession that you love so much, you do it for free, and on top of that, they paid you ridiculously large amounts of money to do it, you're very fortunate. And that indeed was me. And I so I loved it. I loved the travel, and eventually did a lot of work out of England and into Africa, South America, on special freight airlines. So yeah, I had a good career, and but I look back now in the clear light of hindsight, and I remember those endless hours in a on a night flight over, say, the South China Sea, where it's so black you can't even see where the sky ends and the earth begins. And I'd look up at the stars, and you would think that I would have thought more about God than I did. Um, and I suppose I was never agnostic. And I think, like most people, I hoped that someone was in charge of the chaos, but I never sought it out. And so I continued to live a life that became quite successful, and invested my money wisely at the beginning of the tech boom in the 80s. And I had a good life. My nickname, by the way, was Diamond Jim. Whether it was an engine failure at 35,000 feet or a business deal that just blossomed, not out of any kind of particular intelligence, just keeping my ear to the ground from the smart people I was around, and that made me very comfortable in life, shall we say. So life was good, and I married. I met on horseback my wife, and I mentioned horseback because horses play an important part in this story. And when I grew up as a child, in a remote area where we lived, my grandfather logged with horses. And so I grew up crawling under the bellies of horses and watching my grandfather and learning from him. So I've always had a love. And as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm looking out the window at my horses as we speak. So, and they play an important part in the story. So life was good. And, but I suppose, like a lot of people, not just of my generation, but going back since the beginning of mankind, my main focus in life was the achievement of wealth, because wealth gave you freedom. So I thought, and I became good at it, and was rewarded accordingly. But little did I realize how hollow that is. And what I mean by that is whether it was my collection of British sports cars, my large boat, new airplane. I would enjoy those, but then I remember laying awake at night and thinking, "Is this all there is? Is this all there is?" And I would interpret that as meaning I needed more cars or a faster airplane or a bigger boat, and so the next day I would go and buy them. But what I was searching for was something far beyond the wealth of this world. I just didn't know it. And I look back now in absolute amazement that I never really realized it was the absence of God in my life that was creating this emptiness. And so, a charmed life, a beautiful, loving family, and wealth sufficient to take care of pretty much anything I wanted or needed. And on top of that, I was blessed with a good health all my life, and never had so much more than a head cold. But in 2009, 2010, I began to feel different, and I, of course, put it to one side because with my nickname of Diamond Jim, I can overcome anything. So arrogance is a difficult thing. You don't really realize how arrogant you are until you're faced with a true calamity in your life. I have learned the hard way, gentlemen and viewers, that you have to come to the end of yourself before you find the beginning of God. And that's what happened to me. So, to get to the point, I became more and more ill, and then woke up one morning and was unable to stand and was quite ill. I remember that Sunday morning, my wife had gone to church, and of course I never went. And but when she came home, and she's a nurse, she immediately. It was a Sunday, so I had to wait till Monday to see my doctor, and I went to see him, and he examined me and said, "Well, I think you just have maybe a flu that's coming on, so just go home and rest." And so I did, and if nothing improved, in fact, it went downhill. And a couple of days later, I couldn't keep food down, and the paralysis was becoming more pronounced. I was having difficulty walking. So I went in again, and now he was annoyed with me and assured me I was fine. The blood work had not come back yet, but just go home and rest. Well, 2 days later, I dragged myself in there again, and this time I collapsed in the parking lot. Now they pay attention. And my wife advocated very strongly that I'd be admitted to the hospital. And so this was 2009, 2010. And I don't blame the physicians for this. No one could pinpoint what was wrong with me. At first, they thought I had MS, multiple sclerosis, but that proved not to be true. And actually, what was happening was I had contracted a disease called Guillain-Barré. And for those of your listeners who may not be familiar with it, it was first isolated by Dr. Guillain and Dr. Barré of Paris, who first isolated the disease after right around World War I. And not a lot of people have it, although there's more transmission of it now with the Zika virus. Guillain-Barré, named after the two doctors, is the erosion of the myelin sheath on your brainstem. And so the nerves react by not being able to perform the functions that they were created for. A lot of pain, tremendous pain, and nothing that worked. So I'm in the hospital, and they can't figure out what's wrong with me. Many physicians never see this disease in their entire career, and so they don't recognize it. I had one doctor tell me it's a small footnote in their studies, Guillain-Barré. So anyway, but they did bring in a consulting neurologist who had one patient in his lifetime, and so they did a test that required taking fluid from my spine and finding very elevated protein levels, and immediately diagnosed it as Guillain-Barré. But you have a window of opportunity to stop it, and they used plasmapheresis and autoimmunoglobulin therapy. But by this time, almost 2 weeks had passed, and I was really in the throes of being quite ill. And this paralysis creeps up, and if it gets into your lungs, you simply die. So they started intensive blood transfusions and to try and overcome, but it went into full-blown Guillain-Barré. But slowly but surely, and I started to get better. And you would have thought, having faced that, I might have taken the time to cast my eyes heavenward and said, "God, I may not have believed, but thank you." Not me. Arrogance, as I said, is a terrible thing. And, and I say this with all respect, airline captains are somewhat guilty of arrogance. We don't come by it naturally, but when you spend your life delivering hundreds of thousands of people safely to their destination, you feel quite good about that. And you have to be careful, because that sometimes becomes arrogance. And you think about that for a moment. You're flying through severe weather at 35,000 feet, and sitting behind you are a couple of hundred people, a couple of hundred SOBs just wanting to get home to their family, and it's my responsibility. By the way, SOB stands for Souls on Board. So before any of you have a heart attack, I want you to understand that's how the manifest identifies you. souls on board.
Thanks for keeping us in the family friendly zone.
Well, some there's a practical reason, if I might deviate for a moment. Souls on board means lives. So in the event of a catastrophic crash, and you had 297 passengers, and you find 301 bodies, it means you had 4 coffins on board. So there's a practical reason for it. So anyway, souls on board for those of you who almost had a heart attack. So it was, you come by arrogance naturally. And so I'm laying there and I got through it, went through a tremendous amount of physiotherapy, learned to walk again, learned how to swallow, learned how to speak, but was left with tremendous body pain all over. And I'm not talking inconvenient pain, Randy and Sean. I'm talking pain that's all consuming. And those of you who are listening, who are going through or have had experience with that level of pain, it eclipses everything else in your life. And when I got well enough to travel, I went to all the best medical treatments around the world to try to find some sort of cure or relief. And there was nothing. As I said, there's so few cases, relatively speaking, of Guillain-Barré. There's been very little research into it. But I tried with standard medications and so on, did not work. A specialist did recommend that I try an experimental drug from England. And I got permission from the Canadian, or my doctors got special permission from the Canadian health authorities to import the therapeutic drug on a temporary basis to see if it would help. And you know something? It did. It did. And it wasn't an immediate cure, but I could have at least 3 or 4 hours of a day that were, the pain had decreased by 75%. And that was a wonderful gift. But I also discovered that if I took more than the prescription called for, that the pain relief was greater and it lasted longer. And here we enter the slippery slope of over-medicating oneself. But having spent 3 years in absolute pain and isolation, and having lost my ability to ride my horses, to fly a plane, to do all the sports that I loved, to suddenly be able to get some semblance of that back, I grabbed at it. And unknown to my doctors and unknown to my wife, I began to take more of it. And because I was still traveling a lot, I was able to get prescriptions refilled easily. And so that slippery slope of depending on medical outcomes, prescription outcomes, really can come back to bite you. And so fast forward to 2014, and as long as I kept the medication at a high level, I was functioning, still in a lot of pain, but functioning. And I realized that I had to divest myself of a number of my interests, and so I was in the process of selling off companies and land. And so on that evening in April, I had received a request from a company that was acting as my surveying company to go and look at a large tract of land I had that I was trying to sell, and to make sure that the markers were in the correct place. So although I didn't drive much because of my medical condition, it was all on back roads. So I got in my truck and drove to that field, and it was late afternoon, early evening, in 2014, in April, springtime. And I managed to get to the field. And when I drove into the field, I didn't plan it this way, but I was facing the setting sun. And I sat there and turned the truck off and sat there trying to get up the strength to make my way around this large piece of property. And check the markers. And I remember thinking, boy, I don't know if I can do this. That's a long way around. And then I happened to, and I'd gotten into the habit of hiding medication so that my wife wouldn't see that I was overtaking it. And I moved some things in my glove compartment or the console of my truck, and I saw some of the medication, and there was a bottle of pop there, and I thought, well, a few more won't hurt. Famous last words. And so I took them, and knowing full well that I had already taken far more that day than the prescription called for, and I sat back in the truck seat, waiting for that warm relief that I had become accustomed to, of the pain being dulled for a few hours. But as I sat there, something different started to happen, and I remember the feeling of intense heat in my lower legs was so intense that I thought the truck must be on fire. And I looked down quickly, and there was no fire. And this raging heat came rushing up my legs, and then from my fingertips inboard toward my chest. And I tell people, when you've done something catastrophic, and by catastrophic, I mean life-ending. And suddenly it was as though, as my lungs started to seize, it was as though I was in the cab of the truck was filling with water. And I kept raising my head to try to breathe, and I could not. And it was at that moment of realization that I was dying. And remember, I said I wasn't agnostic, but I believe the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes. There are no atheists dying in trucks either. And I remember raising my hand, and it was shaking violently, to the setting sun. And from somewhere really deep inside of me, a place that I had never been to, was this overwhelming feeling of not fear. I'd had engine failures. I'd landed in difficult situations. It wasn't fear. It was a feeling of remorse that I had lived what many, by a standard that many would have thought the ultimate success, and that I'd never thanked the Creator if he existed. And so I raised my shaking hand to the setting sun, and I cried out the first of 6 words, the first 3 of 6 words. And the first 3 words that I cried out was, God, forgive me. Forgive me. And it came, as I said, from a place inside of me I hadn't been to in a long, long time. And when I no sooner got the words out than I collapsed on the steering wheel and hit my head violently, and I was gone. The next thing I'm aware of is tremendous pain on my forehead, and I sit back up, and I'm in the truck, and I'm looking out, and I know time has passed because the sun is now on the horizon as it sets. And then the realization flooded through me that I have no pain. The pain is gone. I finally got it right. You have to take the whole bottle. And I slide out of the truck, and I walk about 15 to 20 feet away, and I feel incredible. It's as though I've taken off a heavy, wet overcoat, and with it, the pain. And I feel like I'm 16 again, and I'm just overwhelmed and overjoyed. And I'm looking out at the setting sun. I can hear the birds. It's springtime. I can smell the grass. And I am just overwhelmed that the medication finally worked. And then I turn and look toward my truck. And I'm outraged. Outraged. Someone is in my truck. Not only that, he has the audacity to be sleeping on my steering wheel. And so I turn to go over there and give him a good what for. Have you ever had a dream where you're trying to run from something and it's as though your feet can't move? And I realized that as hard as I tried, my feet would only move an inch or two at a time. And I'm stunned. Why, I feel so good. Why can't I just run over there and grab this guy? But I do make slow progress. And then I look up. And gentlemen, the realization that the man in the truck leaning over the steering wheel is no stranger. It is me. How can this be? I am here and yet I'm there. How can this be? And of course, being a guy that could fix anything and in my arrogance, I immediately concocted a scheme that if I could just get over there and get back in my body, everything will be okay. And so I struggled to get over there. And I know it's me because my head is turned this way on the steering wheel and there's blood gushing from my mouth and nose. And I struggled to get closer to get back into my body, but suddenly I began to rise. Now, as a pilot, I'm a good judge of altitude. And as I'm rising, I'm stunned because how can this be? And I look, and now I'm drifting slowly backwards, but rising continuously. And I can look down and see the bed of my truck, see my toolbox, and I'm stunned. I rise a little higher, and then something made me look up instead of down because I could see the surrounding area. I can look through the back window of the truck. I can see my body sloped over the wheel. And then I turn and I look up. And there, right in front of me, is this golden circle. It's maybe 200 feet away. It's about 60 feet in diameter. And it's like a golden wedding ring. And then suddenly the center of it filled with a golden light. And I had the impression that it swung inwards and backwards like the door of an old-fashioned safe. And immediately my body went into a reclining position of about 45 degrees. And I mean, unless you've lived under a rock in a cave, I think everyone has heard of the tunnel of light, but I never paid any attention to it. And suddenly I began to go forward toward this tunnel of light. And as I went through the ring, I could see what was an immense distance, and all of it covered with cloud that was golden, but a distinct path through the center. And it seemed once I realized what this was, it was as though I had pushed the throttles on an L-1011 forward on V to achieve V1 on takeoff. And I felt this tremendous force of speed. And I went at tremendous speed into this tunnel of light, reclining backwards about 45 degrees. And to give you an idea of the speed, I could feel the stars streaming by, see the stars streaming by. I mentioned that in Baltimore one night when I was speaking. There was a young guy in the front row, and he said, sounds like the opening of the Star Trek to me. And that's a pretty good analogy. It was the stars streaming by. And I was terrified because being a technical person, always understanding why things were happening, wanting to learn, I was absolutely baffled. There was no rationale, no technical reason I could attach to this. And I'm the other thing that I remember vividly was that when you're going fast, whether you're in your convertible or in a speedboat or on your motorbike, you hear the rush of the wind. You hear the noise of the air. Nothing. Complete silence. And yet the sensation of tremendous speed.
And so, Jim, you just said you were in a kind of a place where you were kind of terrified and scared. Did you enter further into the light and immediately encounter Jesus or angels, or was there a darkness that tried to pull you in first?
I suddenly became aware of a bright light at the end of the tunnel that was even lighter than the tunnel. And as I came toward it, I decelerated and came upright. And I find myself facing, I still don't know whether to call it a door or a portal. It's covered in mist. But I do know I have no choice because I sense that the tunnel is closing behind me. And so I step through this mist-covered portal and gingerly put one foot inside because I cannot see what I'm stepping onto, and felt something firm. I brought my other foot in. I look down, the mist starts to clear, and I'm stunned because I'm looking at the most perfect green grass I've ever seen. Each blade beautiful in its symmetry and its evenness. I now know what they mean by the grass is always greener on the other side. They're talking about heaven. And then the mist clears in front of me. I look up, and to my right, there's this beautiful mist lifting off this field, and the field is covered in flowers of so many colors, and colors that I have no name for. And I mean, I've traveled on every 52 countries in the world. I've been in the most beautiful places, and nothing compared to this. And I'm stunned by the beauty of it and the rolling fields, and it seemed to go on forever. And this beautiful vault of a darker blue sky than we're used to here on Earth, but no sun. Because as a pilot, I was trying to orient myself, and I thought if I could find the sun, I know in my southeast, southwest, no sun. Everything seemed to generate a light that created this fusion of color. And then I swung my vision to the left, and as I left that beautiful vista on the right, the grass went from green to brown to black to scorched. And I was really taken by and looking for the technical reason. Why would there be this dichotomy between these two vistas? And that darkness continued to the left and into what seemed to be a crevasse. And I guess I'm just naturally inquisitive. I made a few tentative steps to the left to see what was beyond this chasm. And as I looked down, and it was as though the walls of this chasm were covered with a shiny black coal, anthracite. And as I looked down, the first thing I saw was at the very pit of the bottom of this abyss was a fire, a red fire, as though you would glimpse a campfire in a distant valley. And but I was caught by the difference, and not only that, there was a sense of gloom, a miasma. I've learned a sense of dread. I think ever since we crawled out of caves, we've always feared the darkness. And so I started to turn away from this, but then something happened. The fire became greater at the bottom. And as I'm looking down, two things happened. The brightness of the fire increased, and I realized that down and looking sideways, it was as though a door had opened, a large door. And I could hear a sound for the first time. And the sound was the sound of two large doors being forced open on hinges that had not been oiled, and you could hear them screeching and so on, and just rusty. And of course that flooded more light, so I realized the light was coming from the side to the bottom. And then, to my utter amazement, something shuffled out of that doorway. The doorway was huge, and so was the creature that came out. And I'm looking down on it, and it appeared to have a form, large, round. It was on fire. Its body was on fire. Its head was squat on its shoulders, and it seemed to be searching around the bottom of this pit for something. And and I and then suddenly it was as though it became aware of me, and it swiveled its head around and looked up at me. And fellas, I can tell you something. The look of hatred that I saw in its glowing eyes, not just for me, but for all of mankind, will stay with me forever. On top of that, there was an odor that came out of that pit, a sense of decay, a sense of all things bad, as I said, a miasma. And I turned because I couldn't bear to look at it. But just the second before I turned, it began to scramble up the sides of that pit. Now, for its size, it was large. It moved with an amazing nimbleness. And it crawled very rapidly up the side of that pit. And I scrambled backwards, falling backwards on my elbows, and it reared up out of the pit. And I was confronted by this creature, body on fire, dripping saliva, and the most horrendous face. But the other thing was there was screaming, and the screaming was coming not from its mouth. The screaming appeared to be coming from within the body. It was as though this creature, Randy, had consumed souls, and they were crying out for mercy. And it stepped out of the pit and lumbered toward me. And to keep my sanity, I scrambled to my feet and turned my back to it. And remember, I said there's 6 words. I said the first 3, God forgive me. And then I turned and I turned toward the beautiful light, and I raised both hands, and this time I cried out the next 3 words. 3 words that I had never prayed in my life. God, help me. Help me. And instantly, 3 points of light appeared in that beautiful cerulean blue sky, converging toward me. One was coming from about 90 degrees, the other one from about 260, and the other one from about 310, and all converging into one. At the same time, this creature is behind me. And then, in addition to the screaming, I heard it speak my name. This creature knew me. It knew me. I wasn't that bad a person. I may not have gone to church, but I was not. What did I do to deserve this? All these thoughts were racing through my mind. And I gave to the poor if there was a tax receipt. But what did I do to deserve this? And it had a strange voice. It was in between a growl and a whisper. And I could hear it saying, Jim, we are here for you. We are here for you. Join us. Come to us. And I honestly believe that had I turned at that moment and looked into its face, I would have been snatched. But instead, I concentrated on this beautiful light coming toward me. And all of a sudden, the lights fused together, and I'm looking at this light traveling toward me, and the light washed over me. And at that point, I turned to look back. And Randy, when that light struck that creature, it screeched and screamed in agony and scrambled backwards like a rat running for cover. Darkness and evil cannot live in the light of God. It must not live in the light of God. And I turned back to look, and I mean, I might not have gone to church. but I knew what an angel was. And suddenly I'm looking at three magnificent beings coming toward me. Very tall, very elegant, silver, long hair, beautiful golden light, which was, as I learned later, a refraction of their golden wings that creates this, what we call a halo. It's the light on their silver hair from their wings when their wings are extended. And I remember being astonished because the feeling of love and peace and safety that flooded over me when just mere seconds before I felt all this hatred and evil toward me was truly overwhelming. And so they came right up to me, and the first one approached me. And of all the things that I will always remember about this incredible encounter were their eyes. Now imagine these creatures, these beautiful creatures, 10 feet tall, another one about 12 feet tall, and then the one coming behind dressed in warrior gear, truly a guardian angel, about 15 feet tall. So these are wonderful creatures. So the first one walks up to me and looks down at me. And the thing that I'll always remember, their violet eyes. And then he spoke to me, and his lips didn't move. It was more than telepathy. He was in my mind, and I was in his. And I say he or his. Look, I don't want to use the word androgynous, but they looked like the best of all of us. They had the gentleness of a female and the strength of a warrior, and just this incredible combination of everything that's good. And all of a sudden, I feel this wonderful arm come up and come around my shoulder, and then I'm conscious that this magnificent, huge feathered wing came out around his arm, and he pressed me into his chest. And I looked up into those violet eyes, and I hear this in my mind, this beautiful voice that said to me, "Fear not, James, for we are your constant friends." And now, as you gentlemen probably know, whenever you get an email or a text or a letter from me, I always sign it, "Your constant friend." And so there I am, cuddled up to something that I thought was just a myth, a legend. And I felt so safe and warm. And I have to tell you this, I know we're running late, but I have to tell you this. As I'm being hugged, I suddenly became aware of the incredible smell of warm tapioca. Now, bear with me. And I'm not here to start the Church of the Holy Tapioca. I'm not. But here's something you should know, because you will all experience this. God knows what a huge difference this is for us to encounter him and his beings. And so he gives us something that we loved as a child to make us feel we have come home. And when I was a young boy walking home through a snowstorm in northern Canada in the middle of June, I'd get to my grandmother's house, and I'd go in, and on her wood stove, she would have made warm tapioca for me. Isn't that wonderful? And for some of you, it may be the smell of your mom's perfume. It might be the smell of your dad's burn. It might be any of those things that brought you joy as a child. And for me, it was the smell of tapioca. So I don't mean to digress, Sean, but
I'll help you digress a little bit, Jim, because for me, when I met my grandmother in heaven, it was chocolate chip cookies.
Really?
Yes, that was when I visited her home. That's what I smelled, the first smell. It was kind of a musty odor otherwise in the little bungalow, but those chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
And that was the fragrance in heaven. Yeah. You know, our viewers, Jim, have noted the sometimes the variance in the stories. That is, each of us accounts something a little bit differently, or sometimes significantly differently than what others have mentioned. But I know it doesn't bother you or me in hearing these different accounts, because we can each reach a destination, and along the way, our account of our travels to that destination, and even our expression of how that destination looks and appears to us, is relevant very much to our own experiences, our personality, and all of those things. I just think it reflects the glory of God to know us and what we need. And your account in meeting the creature, I can identify to some extent, having seen a battle between the angels and the demons as I was being pulled by that proverbial light. I thank you for bringing us to the account where you had met the angels, and the warmth of those angels and how they affected you, the three of them. But I've got to ask you this question, Jim, because you are looking over at your horses there. And I recall reading your story. And by the way, our viewers and listeners have got to read Jim's book. It's fantastic. But one of the comments that you made in your book, when you woke up, you had mentioned to your wife, "Well, there are horses in heaven." Yeah. You've got to get to the horses, Jim.
Yeah.
And what you saw there.
All right. I apologize. I am guilty, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, of trying to get as much into the story as I can, because I'm afraid I'll leave something out that may help someone. So anyway, the guardians were wonderful. I felt safe, and then they're very elegant. I do have to tell you this, because I think people would be very interested in this. I was taken by how they bowed to me. They bowed to me. And I felt rather uncomfortable, because I should be bowing to them. And I questioned why, because it was such a bow of respect and subservience, and bowed very low. And they spoke with kind of this Victorian perfection in their voice. I didn't hear any thou or thee, but a very measured tone that incredibly, and with every word they spoke, there was wisdom. Anyway, I questioned the guardian that I eventually found out was mine all my life. Now, that angel had pulled an awful tour of duty, but I digress. But I asked why, and they said, "James, do you not know that when we look at mankind, we see the spark of life of our master?" Isn't that something? We who consider ourselves the lowest of the low are looked at by the angels in awe of us. Anyway, so we walk, and I'll skip forward, but they showed me many things, told me many things. I developed 360-degree omnivision, I call it. I heard everything. I understood everything. The beautiful flowers that spoke to me, that sang to me. But eventually we come to this beautiful pasture, and I guess they knew my love of horses. And again, I think it ties into your comment on your grandmother's chocolate chip cookies, and my love of tapioca, and because they wanted to show me something that would really make me happy. And the second guardian raised his hand, and suddenly, coming from around the grove of trees toward me, and as they trotted across the grass lit up with light from their hooves. And there were three of the most magnificent horses coming toward me. Now, I had never studied the Bible. I had no idea at that time that when Jesus comes back, he'll be riding a white horse. It's in the Bible. And I'm stunned, because as I stand there, and they come right up to the fence, and I had loved their kind all my life, and they seemed to know that. And they looked at me with such love in their eyes. And I reached forward to stroke the neck of the lead horse. And my hand sank right into the body of this being of light. And when I pulled it back, Randy, the light of the horse's body stuck to my hand till I got it 10 to 12 inches beyond, and then it came back into the horse's body. And it was just phenomenal to watch and to experience. And I've come to call it the sticky love of God. Not something you hear every day. So so that was the horses. And so we went from there, and I'll skip through to a really important part. They were showing me more things, and I suddenly was conscious of one of the guardians standing next to me, and he said, "Hold my cloak." And so I reached over and held on, and suddenly we were above, looking down, and I thought I was looking at a reflecting pool, but it opened up, and I realized I'm having an aerial tour of heaven. And I hate using that term because you hear people that talk about our experiences, Randy, and they call it heavenly tourism. What a lack of faith that is, to hear that term of derision. I believe with all my heart, I know this is real. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't hallucinating. And so I was able to look, and I didn't know at that time that I wasn't being allowed to stay. You have to remember that. And people say to me, "Did you see your family?" No, I did not. It was explained to me that later that I could not set foot in the heavenly city, but they would show me the heavenly city. I didn't connect it with the fact that I wasn't staying. So anyway, to see the halls of knowledge, the halls of wisdom, how heaven is laid out. And yes, the streets are gold, but it's not the brassy gold that we come to think of on earth. It's a different shimmer of gold. It's not the Fort Knox kind of gold. So saw many things, had the opportunity to ask many questions. The thing I do want to talk about, because this is a comfort to so many parents, there was one building that stood out among all the rest. And the buildings are made not of stone, not of wood, but of a material that has a light in it. Now that, I don't want it to sound too Las Vegas-y, but it was a gentle, welcoming light. But this particular building glowed with a light that had a warmth to it. And I asked what building that was, and I was stunned when they said, "That is the nursery." And I responded, "Nursery in heaven?" And they said, "Yes, James, this is where the souls of aborted children, or children who die in their innocence from disease, or come back here. And each soul is so precious to God that they're cared for. They grow at a different rate because they're not growing a physical body. So they grow at about 3 times the rate that we do, that a child does on earth. And this is where they take care and so on of the little souls that have been unwanted or have died." And I had no idea how this part of the story would have such an effect on women who have lost children, or who have had to have an abortion at a time in their life when they had no other option. And it's been a blessing to explain to these parents that their child lives. Their child lives. And so, anyway, getting right to the main event. After showing me much more, we came back to paradise, the ground of paradise, which was outside the walls, I learned. And I was looking once again at the horses, and I realized I hadn't seen my guardian for a while. So I turned to look for him, and I saw him, and he was about no more than maybe 40, 50 feet away on a small rise. And but when I looked, he was bent over, almost in a kneeling position, and was holding up a book. And facing him was a more magnificent figure than even the angels, but I couldn't see the face. And it was in profile to me. Do you know how you drive down a hot road on a warm summer day, and there's a shimmer on the pavement? There was this kind of shimmer covering the features of this magnificent being but clearly he was reading what the guardian was holding up. And I took note of the book that the guardian had taken out of his sleeve. And it was as thin as a cheap roadside diner menu. And suddenly the awareness came over me that what the guardian was holding was the book of my life. And instead of it being a book filled with good deeds and kindness, all I had to show for a life that I thought was the epitome of success was this tiny, tiny book. Thin. Charles Dickens wrote a wonderful line when he wrote, "Mankind should have been my business." And instead, it was all about the pursuit of wealth. And all I had to show for it, although I thought myself a kind person, all I had to show for it was this little thin book. I am determined, fellas, that to live my life now, that when I go back, if they permit me to go back, when they open the book of my life for this chapter, they're going to need 3 angels and a forklift to get it open. So anyway, I'm watching, and this figure is leaning forward, clearly intent on the little bit that's written in there, and suddenly the figure straightened up, and the angel folded the book, put it in his sleeve, and disappeared. And then this magnificent figure turned toward me. And as he turned from profile to direct on, suddenly the shimmer, gradually the shimmer that had covered his features vanished. And I found myself face to face with none other than Jesus Christ, the Son of God, someone that I thought was just some old Jewish legend that people had made up to create whatever. And I'm looking at this figure and the magnificence of this figure, not just the look of intense love and concern for me, but this golden light flowed out of him from seemed to start at his head and flow down his body. And it was light that behaved like slow moving water. It flowed off him and it flowed down that slope. And I fell to my knees and tried to crawl toward him. I had to get closer. And it was as though I had finally come home, that I had found what I had searched for all my life. And I started to crawl toward him and to get closer. And then his eyes looked into mine. And when I looked into those eyes of gray and green and blue, I was lost in the love of eternity. This magnificent creature knew me too, but this was a creature of love and forgiveness and desired to know me better. And for a split second, and Randy, you probably experienced this too, although my intellect knew better, it was as though when my eyes met his, it was as though I was the only one in creation, the only one he had ever created. He knew me that intimately and loved me that deeply. And it was a moment that I knew from then on that whatever happened to me, I was his forever, forever. But I just wanted to be around him. And I tried to crawl closer to him, and two guardians appeared beside me and held me back. And I struggled free and continued to climb toward him. And suddenly he raised his right hand, and there was no mistaking what the gesture meant. He was still smiling in a gentle way, but this was a definite command to stop. And I remember the feeling inside of me of not being allowed to come closer. And I waited with, I don't know, bated breath, I guess, if I was breathing, but I was just completely enveloped in the love of his eyes. And then I guess I must have taken another step or two or crawled on my knees, and I heard all of a sudden he raised his hand even higher. And Randy, when he raised his hand, his cloak fell back, and I saw the remains of the crucifixion. And then he looked intently at me, and he began to speak to me. And people say to me, what did it sound like? How can I possibly, I attempt to, but how can I possibly be accurate? But suddenly I heard his voice, and with him, unlike the angels, which was more of a telepathy, not telepathy, but a mind thing, Jesus' face moved just as you or I would, speaking to each other. And then I heard the voice of the Son of God, and it stunned me that he knew my name. He knew me. And he looked at me with the gentlest of smiles, hand still raised, meaning to not come forward. And he said to me, James, my son, this is not yet your time. Go back and tell your brothers and sisters of the wonders we have shown you. And his hand slowly came down and crossed over his left. And I was overwhelmed with the fact that he knew my name. But more than that, I was now coming to the realization that I wasn't being allowed to stay. And I began to plead. I began to beg. Please let me stay. This is what I've yearned for all my existence. I just want to be wherever you are. Please don't send me away. Please let me stay. And I remember saying this, please let me stay. I won't be any trouble. Can you imagine saying that to the Son of God? I won't be any trouble. But I was desperate. And suddenly two guardians appeared beside me and lifted me from the ground and turned me around and were carrying me back down the path. And I wrenched my shoulder away to turn to beg one more time to allow me to stay. And Jesus was gone. But standing exactly in the place where he had stood was this magnificent warrior angel that had greeted me. And all of a sudden, he began to expand. He grew even taller than 15 feet, and he put his wings out to their full magnificence. And they spread out and upward in this beautiful gold, and he was surrounded with light. And the message was clear that he was barring the way forward for me. And suddenly, I feel the angels hold me again. Everything goes dark, and I'm in a black tunnel, and I can hear water, and it's cold, and it's painful, and I feel like I'm descending at tremendous speed. But unlike the tunnel of light, there's no beauty. There's just darkness, and I'm going down this steep descent, and suddenly, I guess they tell me that I scared the daylights out of the nurses because I had been, of course, triaged, and they had told my wife that there was no hope of me coming back, that there was no brain sign, no sign of dreaming, no sign of hallucinating, nothing. And brain sign, of course, is the measure of death, not heartbeat. They, of course, had triaged me, had me hooked up to everything. There was complete renal failure of all my organs. And the doctors had said to Lorraine that they would keep me until our children arrived to say goodbye, and then they would recommend that she pull the plug on the machinery that was flowing blood through my organs. And suddenly I come upright and scared the daylights out of the nurse, she told me, and later, and screaming around all the tubes because I was intubated. And they ran and got my wife and said, "Mrs. Woodford, come quickly, come quickly." And Lorraine's a nurse. She ran into the room and she couldn't believe it. She said, my eyes were as big as saucers. I was trying to orient from the beauty of heaven to lying on a gurney. And she climbed up on the bed with me and started to cry, and they were watching my blood pressure come back to normal. All my organs start to operate again. So eventually they pulled the tube out so I could speak clearly, and my throat was terribly sore and raw. And I looked into my wife's pretty face, and I said, Lorraine, I saw Jesus, and Jesus has horses." Of all the things I could have said to her, Jesus has horses. And I'm back.
Wow, there's so many directions we could go after everything you've shared. But I want to be conscious of our time because we are starting to get to the end of our time together today. In terms of what you understood is why you came back, what your mission, your calling was on this side of your heaven journey, what shifted for you? How was your mission different on this side of your experience?
Just let me quickly tell you this. What the words that Jesus said to me, James, he knew my name, my son. He's the father of us all. This is not yet your time. That implies to me that if I live a good life, there will be a time when I'll go back. Go and tell, which I'm doing with you now, your brothers and sisters of the wonders we have shown. And that's what I try to do every day. And, and the cynics out there, when they see me hawking a book, the funds from this book go to help all the poor that we can find. It's not a lot, but we do what we can.
That's another thing that I think that has been noted by some of the listeners or viewers, and I too, Jim, have authored a book. They think, oh, well, they're just taking advantage of the opportunity, really, and that kind of discounts the story in itself. In reality, many of the accounts that we've heard really are those that where either the author has reluctantly entered into writing a book or has been compelled by this edict that they felt from the Lord saying, you need to share this story. But I don't know if I've run across a single one who is a born again believer in Jesus Christ who has profited through this process. Well, there you go. Jim hasn't either, So it all goes back into the ministry. It all goes back to helping others.
Well, sadly, as we all know, there are, shall we say, people preaching that do it for money only. And so the rest of us are tarred with that brush. I don't look for any of that. I don't want any of that, but we do want to help all we can.
Yes. And your story, Jim, gives glory to Jesus Christ. And that's what I think is the determinant of what is a testimony that the Lord wants to be shared publicly in forms like this, versus others who may share it and kind of give that glory to them. They feel enlightened or something to that effect. I know Jim and I share this. I actually have to say, Jim, to you, that when I hear you, and I've heard your story before, of course, read your book, that I have an affinity for what you went through. And there may be a few others as well, where I'm with you in that experience. That is, I have a koinonia relationship with what you've gone through. Even though our accounts are varied, there is that very identifiable kind of feeling and gripping. I don't know if viewers noticed I was kind of tearing up because when you went there, Jesus, I couldn't hold it in. There's that, to me, personally testifies of the reality and also the need to tell this story publicly and to give glory to the Lord of his reality and his truth and his love. So, Jim, I just have one final question for you. You've shared very openly in your account. The question I have is, and you've touched on it before, but this experience in and of itself, why do you think that the Lord gave you this experience? Because not everybody does have this experience. Why do you think he gave it to you, especially you, and what have you done with it? Obviously, we've done a lot of good things with it, but what's your kind of central message that you want to convey to others?
That's something I've often thought about. And why me? And in the first few times that I started to speak publicly about this, I said, I have no idea why God chose me. And there was an older pastor in the front pew of the church, and he stood up immediately and he said, Jim, why not you? Why not you? And he said, you will live a life of criticism, but none of that will matter because you are doing what God told you to do. Go and tell your brothers and sisters. And so that's what drives me. And it was my friends at Destiny Publishing, who I met through my co-author, Tom Gardner, who convinced me really to do the book, because I too had concerns about being perceived as someone who did this for money. And sadly, as I said earlier, there are people that do it. But so coming back to your original question, Randy, I really don't know, but I'm trying to do the best job I can for God. And when Jesus asks you to do something, man, you get filled with a feeling of power that you never felt before. So I'm just doing what I was told.
Well, and I'll say for me, in terms of Jim's story, a couple things that stand out as I try to think in my mind and contrast with what others have shared. Certainly, the horses in heaven, that's an element that's unique. We've had another guest talk about encountering her dogs in heaven, and not everybody experiences animals in heaven, but that's certainly something unique from Jim's story. And then for me, I love the interaction that he had with the angels. Not everybody has that depth or that much experience encountering angels in heaven, and so that's something that really just stood out to me from his story. Randy, I don't know if you want to comment anything for you that really stands out from Jim's story.
Yes, and that is the moment that Jim went in, is the condition of his heart. And I mean spiritual. I'm talking about the soul that he went into this experience with, versus some of the others that we've listened to. For example, Jim testified that he wasn't an agnostic, but he wasn't, this person who, was praise the Lord, hallelujah all of the time. He just wasn't he wasn't that type of person. He was a successful person, and the worldly success kind of reflected in what he thought would be a success in God's terms. So you take that account of somebody who is not the faith is not as firm as it is certainly today, versus somebody who goes into this experience having known the Lord, served, whether it be in church teaching or whether it be just whatever it is in ministry. And that experience is a little bit different. But we have heard a number of accounts where people have experienced these kind of demonic elements. And some of the comments that we've received are, I don't want to see that. I don't want to go through that when I die. I want to go right straight to Jesus, right? I don't want to go through what these other accounts have said. I don't want to be at the effect of possibly being called into hell. And the good news is, and something that struck me, Jim, with your account, is that you knew to whom you had to cry out to. That's when your heart compelled you to testify of Jesus Christ and the need for him. He brought you immediately into his presence. And I think that speaks encouragement to those who have lost loved ones. And they're thinking, they really didn't, live the life, and I don't know where they are today. The Lord loves his creation so much that he gives every opportunity for that person to know him and to receive him and to be with him forever in eternity in heaven. And, there is that period of time between, as you mentioned, Jim, the heart stops and the brain stops. It's a short period of time. The longest studies have shown maybe up to 6 minutes, but no longer. Yours was hours, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, pardon me for interrupting, but in the brief time we have left, the reason it says 11 hours, that was from the time, that's based on the time that I was found and the time I resuscitated. In other words, the medical history. But time doesn't matter. This. Time is different there. It's time exists, but it's different. And I don't know if I was 11 hours or 11 years or 11 seconds. All I know is that everything I needed to learn, everything they wanted me to learn, I learned. And as I mentioned, for the cynics and the Facebook comments that are rude and unbelieving and so on, that's nothing compared to the hundreds of thousands that have reached out to me and said, "You helped me so much," And just 2 nights ago, I had a gentleman call me because I'm easy to get, and said, "I want you to know I was prepared to end my life, and I saw you on on a TV program as I was getting ready to go out the door to leap off a bridge." That is incredible, and I hope that they have recorded that so that this time the book of my life, if I'm chosen to go back, will be worth the time for Jesus to read.
Wow. Well, that's a powerful testimony to certainly end on. Jim, we want to make it easy for people to find you, to connect with you. Where do we discover you on the web?
Jim Woodford Ministries, Heaven and Unexpected Journey is available on Amazon. And just call me. My phone number is on my website.
And like we do with every episode, we'll put links to Jim's website, places you can connect with him on social media, and links to where you can pick up your very own copy of the new book as well. We're so honored that Jim came back a second time. We had a technical issue with our first recording, and it went bye-bye. And so we actually got to record this one again. So we're glad Jim came back.
Sean, I think that was satanic. So.
Yeah. Yes, I'm not sure what was wrong with that first one, but we did get the second one down.
But he can't keep 3 Christian dudes down.
Right. That's right. As soon as we're done with this episode, I'm like downloading this one, putting it in the vault. We'll keep it safe. We'll let this one be taken away. But Jim, truly an honor. Thank you for sharing with us, pouring into our audience. We really appreciate it. we, just like everybody else, is so touched and encouraged by your short story. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you. God bless you both.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Jim.